The first snow rarely comes with a fanfare. It just arrives, silently, blanketing ambition, potatoes, and uninsulated dreams. For early settlers in North America, winter wasn't merely a season. It was an unrelenting endurance trial with poor catering, where survival required persistence, creativity, and an unreasonable relationship with root vegetables. Let's begin in a cabin. Not a charming ski lodge kind, mind you. No crackling fireplace or a cup of hot cocoa with pillowy marshmallows. More like, you wake up and your socks froze overnight while wearing them. Now, imagine you're one of these settlers. You've chopped enough wood to supply a small British fleet, and still, by February, your fingers are debating early retirement. Your log cabin, which you poured your summer soul into, lets in breezes with the discretion of an open invitation. The roof leaks slightly, not enough to collect water, but just enough to remind you that nature is winning. Inside, there's porridge, so much porridge, because it's made from oats, which are nearly indestructible, and you have precisely 0 time to think about culinary flair. Early winter breakfasts were hot, in temperature only, bland, sticky, and served day after unvaried day. Porridge was the edible version of surrender. Add to that some stewed apples, if you were fancy, or salt pork, and you had yourself a classic frontier feast. Complaining wasn't an option. Survival didn't leave room on the menu for preferences. Even chores became more existential. Fetching water meant carrying it from a frozen stream, while pretending frostbite builds character. Laundry froze stiff on the line, forming eerie linen ghosts in the yard. The notion of air drying had less to do with drying and more to do with freezing your shirts into polite flat planks you could stack like very sad papyrus scrolls. Then there's the issue of boots, or rather, the lack of them. Settlers often had one good pair, shared if necessary. Children might wrap their feet in scraps of cloth and hope for the best. There were no Gore-Tex miracles or heated socks. If your boots got wet, you dried them by the fire, along with your feet, your dignity, and occasionally a stray raccoon looking to share the warmth. Social life in winter pivoted toward the surreal. Even for the most stoic personalities on the edge of civilization, cabin fever was a real, ominous thing. Long nights were broken up by storytelling, mending, candle dipping, or if someone was feeling particularly festive, shadow puppets. Do not underestimate the excitement level of a cleverly executed goose shape on a candlelit wall after 16 hours of silence. But perhaps the most critical character in our tale of wintry patience is the humble stove. Prior to innovations like the cast-iron Franklin stove, a delightful invention by America's favorite kite flyer, Benjamin Franklin, settlers depended on open hearths that weren't particularly efficient. They devoured firewood with the hunger of a teenager, requiring several cords just to keep the room slightly less freezing than outside. Franklin's stove changed the game, operating more efficiently and producing fewer indoor smoke-related accidents, previously known as Tuesday. Of course, the body heat of every family member, pet, and stray chicken played a role in insulation. Chickens, specifically, often wintered indoors, adding both warmth and a certain barnyard ambience to your early American living room. Food storage was its own adventure. Root cellars, deep pits dug into the earth where potatoes, turnips, and hope were kept cool, prevented spoilage. But reaching them during a snowstorm, that was a cardio workout with a side of existential dread. Lucky were those who stocked their shelves correctly. Unlucky were those who misjudged and faced March with only vinegar and flour. Yet somehow, Even in this frosty monotony, beauty could be found. A frost-kissed window pane, the sound of snow falling onto snow, the sip of something warm while watching the world slow down. Early settlers were tired, cold, and occasionally cranky, but they also saw the stars clearer than most of us have ever dared. So tonight, as you lie under your own layered blankets in your far more temperate home, let the crackles of history lull you to sleep. You're surrounded by invisible legacies, paved by people who once wrestled with icy chamber pots and never-ending porridge, and still found time to laugh at shadow geese. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. By late autumn, when the last stubborn leaves had surrendered to the wind and the world was blanketed with the dread of impending iciness, early settlers began enacting an annual ritual that can best be described as the Great Panic. This wasn't the festive, cocoa-fueled anticipation of snowflakes and sleigh bells. No. This was the deeply Victorian form of panic, where everyone quietly assumed they might not survive the season and calmly went about hoarding root vegetables. Contrary to popular depictions in nostalgic paintings and suspiciously rosy school textbooks, preparing for winter was less charming homestead tranquility and more improvised bear-proofing while sobbing into a turnip. Take the common New England settler, for example. Not that he or she had much in the way of options other than knew anything really. As soon as the harvest was gathered, a process that involved breaking one's back in 5 layers of wool while dodging wasps the size of joy, the family turned their attentions to sealing up the home with a seriousness usually reserved for containing a dragon. Windows were stuffed with rags, gaps in the walls were sealed with mud, and anyone small enough to fit under the floorboards was promptly sent there with a candle to chase out rats, often emerging with stories that would haunt them until at least menopause. Chimneys were cleaned, mostly because if one caught fire in January, there wasn't much to do but let it burn while gathering outside in the snow to contemplate the futility of human achievement. Wood was chopped in obsessive quantities, stacked against the house in great haphazard piles designed less by engineering than by the constant fear of freezing solid like a colonial popsicle. Of course, the real soul of winter preparation lay underground, in the root cellar, otherwise known as the original refrigerator, or nature's dungeon of potatoes. Here, settlers stored all the things they hoped wouldn't kill them over the winter. Turnips, carrots, onions, squashes, all slumbering in the cool earth, dreaming whatever dreams parsnips dream. Preserving food was less about taste and more about simply keeping things edible, or at least bland enough that no one could tell if it had started to ferment or was just very excited to be eaten. Pickling was popular. Truly, early winter pantries were just rows and rows of jars filled with translucent objects floating mysteriously in vinegar. You could spend a whole season trying to guess, is it a pear, a beet, a boot heel? Meat preservation was its own grand ordeal. Without refrigeration, settlers turned to centuries-old European methods involving salt, smoke, and hope. Hams were hung from rafters like wind chimes for wolves. Sausages were made with every part of an animal that still listened to gravity. And if you were lucky enough to own a smokehouse, you basically had a small building dedicated to making every passing dog weep with longing. The dangers of winter weren't limited to food, of course. Clothing mattered just as much, if not more. And sadly, colonial winter fashion was less about expression and more about insulation. Early settler attire during the cold months involved so many layers of wool that many resembled vaguely mobile haystacks with boots, scratchy, hot in the wrong places, and impossible to remove in a hurry. Not that hurrying was often an option. Staying warm was absolutely a layered affair. Children were bundled to proportions that suggested their parents feared blizzards, and God equally. Babies might vanish entirely into swaddling clothes, only to be discovered again in April, mildly annoyed, but otherwise unharmed. Housing itself was the final fragile frontier. Most were wooden cabins with basic fireplaces and a collection of cold spots so dramatic they deserved their own names. Bedrooms upstairs, if they existed, were generally unheated. Everyone slept under mounds of quilts, pressed together like burritos of hope. In harsher climates, livestock might be brought indoors for warmth, which was terribly cozy until you remembered cows don't do personal boundaries. And yet, despite the drafts, the thin windows, and the thick layers of despair, there was an odd beauty to it. The fire glowed golden in the hearth. Hands warmed over steaming porridge. The wind howled and the snow fell. But inside these determined little homes, life went on. A kind of peace settled over the frozen countryside. Not because things were easier, but because, after all that preparation, there wasn't much left to do but sit, survive, and perhaps knit another pair of socks. And in the quiet hush of candlelight, as snow softly whispered against wooden shutters, something unexpected began to stir. The brittle beginning of stories, of shared songs, and the subtle, slow battle against a much greater foe than frost alone. If you were an early settler in the dead of winter, there are two things you'd likely be low on: firewood and patience. And unfortunately, you couldn't just throw the latter in the stove. You see, while summer had arrived dripping with optimism and mosquitoes, and autumn was full of the busy satisfaction of harvest and moderately fewer mosquitoes, winter took all that cheerful energy, rubbed its icy hands together, and laughed in a sinister Czech accent. Not sure why Czech, it was just that kind of winter. Now, imagine January in a woodland clearing in the early 1700s. Snow had fallen again, though the thrill had worn off several feet ago. Everything, and I do mean everything, was cold. The outhouse, frigid. The bed, a wooden plank garnished lightly with straw and regret. The butter, solid enough to be considered a defensive weapon. Entire days passed without a single warm spot, unless you counted the goat. And let's be honest, everyone counted the goat. Settlers hadn't yet discovered the joy of central heating. No cozy radiators humming in the corner. No heated floors or fuzzy socks mass-produced in faraway factories. You had a fireplace, which sounded romantic until you realized it only heated the 2 feet directly in front of it. For the rest of the cabin, frost politely installed itself on the inside of the windows and showed no signs of leaving. Firewood was the frontier version of cryptocurrency, obsessively hoarded, wildly volatile in value, and not everyone really understood how much they had until they needed it. Chopping wood was everyone's least favorite extreme sport, especially after December, when the axe froze solid to your gloves and the logs developed a smug, split-proof exterior. Most households had a firewood pile outside that, come January, was just a polite way of saying snow-covered disappointment we call kindling. To get a fresh log, you'd trudge through the snow, knee-deep if you were lucky, thigh-high if the snow gods were in a silly mood, only to locate a heap of frozen timber that refused to stack properly, let alone burn. And then, oh yes, there were the root cellars. Root cellars were the settlers' version of a fridge, if the fridge was buried underground and had an alarming fondness for turnips. Families stored potatoes and squash and jars of pickled something down there, accessed not by swinging a door open, but via a trapdoor and rickety ladder that might as well have been designed by someone morally opposed to safety. Of course, winter, being the persistent party guest that it was, meant that you had to go out in the cold to get food, brave the wind, descend into the abyss of produce, retrieve a slightly wrinkled carrot, trudge back in, and attempt to turn it into soup. Stew was the great culinary hope, all edible things combined in a pot and given enough time to become something at least pretendable as dinner. A good settler learned to love soup. A less good settler learned to fake it very convincingly. Then there was clothing, or as it should be called, never quite enough clothing. Settlers wore wool everything. Wool socks, wool mittens, wool caps, even wool underwear, which was as dignified and comfortable as it sounds. Not very. When the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and there were always cracks, it was as though the house was saying, "You sure about this? You sure you didn't want to be born in Tuscany?" Sleep was an elaborate ritual involving warming rocks near the fire and then stuffing them into bed before joining them yourself. Families huddled close for warmth, not just out of affection, but because temperatures regularly visited single digits and didn't leave until April. You didn't sleep spread out luxuriously. You bundled like a human burrito, praying your breath wouldn't freeze to your own eyebrows. It was during these long, blizzard-kissed nights that the settlers' mental patience was truly stretched. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase, it was a seasonal condition. People started to loathe their housemates' chewing sounds. One wrong board game move from Uncle Elias, and someone might threaten exile to the snowbanks. Neighbors you greeted cheerfully in fall. By late winter, you might regard with mild suspicion, if only because they last borrowed salt and hadn't repaid it in 2 moons. But winter, despite its icy routines and unrelenting gloom, also taught settlers the craft of endurance, how to hibernate with dignity, complain poetically about frostbite, and ration both fire and fruit preserves like subtle philosophers. As the hearth dimmed and yet another evening curled around the cabin, like a ghost with cold fingers, the early Americans leaned deeper into the quiet, into the creak of snow on the rooftop, into the monotony made sacred simply by surviving one more day. And yet, even the most seasoned settler could not have anticipated what awaited during the next chapter of the season's slow siege. The hearth was the glowing soul of every settler's home, and during the winter months, it became more than a source of heat. It was a battleground where pioneers fought frost with firewood, and occasionally, with sheer passive-aggressive glares at damp, logs that refused to catch. Imagine yourself in a log cabin, somewhere between the edges of the wild and the very barely civilized. Outside, the snow has achieved that magical level of deep where one's boots disappear almost entirely, and you begin to suspect winter is attempting to silently swallow you. Inside, the wind presses against the walls like a nosy neighbor demanding gossip, while icicles dangle with suspicious confidence from the eaves. Now, you might think early settlers spent their winters gently sipping broth, knitting woolen mysteries, and philosophizing about soil. Alas, the reality would have tested even the most stoic philosopher's ability to remain elegant while their toes attempted mutiny. First, heating. Unlike today, where central heating hums softly like a distant lullaby, colonial heating involved embers, frustration, and the whole family disputing over who was hoarding the warmest blanket. Keeping a fire alive through the night required strategy and, often, sacrifice. Enter the banked fire, a clever if slightly moody practice of covering embers with ashes to keep them smouldering until morning. Of course, this didn't always work. Some mornings began with settlers crouching by a stone-cold hearth, whispering profanity into kindling until sparks relented. Firewood became its own economy. Those who chopped it were admired for both strength and stubbornness. Those who didn't chop it, well, they had cold toes. A cord of wood could take up to 128 cubic feet of storage, which sounds terribly specific because, well, stacking logs is one of the few things during colonial winters that could be measured as a form of actual progress, small joys. But even as the fire crackled, there was the ever-persistent issue of food. Winter was the great reveal. It told everyone just how bad you were at pickling. A poorly preserved barrel of cabbage could turn any cheerful cabin into a fermentation crime scene. Salted pork, dried beans, and hardtack, the triangle of culinary disappointment, provided the backbone of meals during the frozen months. Not because they were delicious, but because they stubbornly refused to rot. The well-prepared families had root cellars, dark and cool spaces buried beneath homes where potatoes and turnips lived out their winter retirement in quiet dignity. Root cellars were both larders and testaments to a settler's foresight. If you remembered to store carrots, congratulations. You could crunch your way through January like a frosty rabbit with a plan. But beyond warmth and food, winter tested something more delicate, the human mood. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase. It was a literal diagnosis a settler might apply to their children 2 months into snowbound life, when everyone had played every game, read every verse of the Bible, and aggressively lost at every attempt to make shadow puppets interesting. This, perhaps, is where boredom became its own form of survival. Long hours by dim candlelight were spent making lists, carving spoons, reciting stories, and mending clothes that had been mended too many times. A sock might begin the season as defensive footwear and quietly exit spring as something closer to a patchwork declaration of defeat. And then there was the weather. Early settlers had a complicated relationship with the sky. A clear one meant the cold would slap you in the face like a frozen trout. A snowy one meant you couldn't leave, lest you want to pull an Oregon Trail reenactment from your front step to your neighbor's barn. Colonists learned to read clouds, sniff the wind, and make utterly vague pronouncements like "feels like snow," which everyone would nod solemnly at, as though they weren't already knee-deep in it. Yet, amidst all this frostbitten chaos, there was something quietly magical. Snow muffled the world, making the woods and hills seem softer, more secretive. The nights were longer, yes, but the stars burned, brighter when the sky wasn't elbowed every 5 minutes by sunlight. The fire, despite its mood swings, became a hearth of stories, whispered memories, tall tales, and warnings that probably weren't entirely invented. Winter was a sly teacher. It asked colonists to slow down, to endure, and most importantly, to learn that nothing quite makes you appreciate spring like trying to eat another spoonful of pickled beets with a straight face. As the snow groaned under the weight of yet another flake, and the wind howled a lullaby, only trees seemed to understand. Settlers huddled closer, sighed softly, and waited. For daybreak, for spring, or at least for the fire to behave itself long enough for one cup of warmth, and just beyond the window pane where frost traced secret alphabets, something stirred in the woods, not a threat, but a sign of something coming, something quieter, colder, and more curious still. It was some time after the first frost had whispered across the soil and stolen the last breath from the garden beans that the real contest of survival began. Early settlers, those brave, sometimes regrettably unprepared souls, stared down winter as if it were a polite but mischievous guest who always overstayed its welcome. By late November, they weren't just enduring the cold, they were becoming frost philosophers, learning the difference between chilly, bone-chilling, and why is the ink freezing in my inkwell? The cabins, if one could call them that without offending actual architecture, had walls with enough gaps to host a modest squirrel family, to say nothing of the wind that slipped in like a gossiping spirit. Chinking, that is, the noble act of stuffing every crevice with mud, straw, or whatever wasn't currently on fire, helped a bit. But it was like dressing a bear in a cardigan and saying you've domesticated it. Inside these creaking timber cocoons, families huddled together not out of love, though there was surely some of that, but because human body heat was one of the most reliable sources of warmth, right next to arguing over who forgot to add more logs to the fire. Fires were treasured, fires were tended, and sometimes fires simply abandoned their duties and went out in a sulk during one of the coldest nights of January. When that happened, someone had to volunteer, as gently as possible, to stumble outside and retrieve fresh wood from the stack, which had been cleverly placed a daring 12 feet from the front door, next to the bear prints. That distance, in sub-zero winds, somehow felt like crossing an Antarctic plain in one's nightshirt. Some scholars suggest that this chore was occasionally assigned through the time-honored method of knot it. Food, meanwhile, had to be rationed with a level of mathematics that no one had practiced since leaving Europe. Salt pork, hardtack, beans, and whatever root vegetables could survive long enough not to become mushy prophets of doom lined the pantry shelves. Fresh anything was a distant memory by January, except for fresh complaints, which were in ready supply. Water had to be fetched, not from the tap, it hadn't been invented, but from the frozen river or well outside, where the bucket often came up with more ice than hydration. After chipping at this frosty lump like a stubborn uncle cracking jokes at his own expense, it could then be melted over the fire in a pot large enough to scald someone, if enthusiasm got the better of them. Sleep was an activity performed in layers. Wool coats, extra shawls, and sometimes just the family dog. Blankets were fewer than necessary, and dreams were often interrupted by the low, echoing creaks of a house contracting in the cold, a sound that many settlers were convinced was either a ghost or the timber giving up. Yet, if you listen closely to the pages of diaries from that time, usually written in cramped handwriting by candlelight, as ink did in fact have a nasty habit of freezing, you'd catch quiet moments of cheer, children telling stories under quilts, the occasional fiddle pulled down for a song, and neighbors inviting one another over when the weather wasn't actively trying to assassinate travelers. If nothing else, January's greatest invention may have been the shared potluck, where everyone brought what they had, and no one admitted it was only turnips again. There were small rituals too, the daily breaking of the morning ice in the water bucket, the methodical construction of fresh fires, the sacred art of kindling placement passed down like a prized family recipe, and of course, the tallying of days until spring, affectionately referred to as both the hopometer and my sanity calendar. Despite all hardship, the human instinct to poke humor into misery like a stick into a snowbank survived. Indeed, one unnamed settler was said to have wrapped a potato in cloth, placed it in his bed at night to keep warm, and in the morning, ate it out of sheer gratitude, for warming both the heart and the stomach. And now, as February tiptoes onto the settlers' calendars with its deceitful suggestion that time is moving forward, and not just looping through a cold purgatory, we'll draw a woolly breath and drift gently toward the next tale in our frosty chronicle. A time when even the strongest wills began to creak like snow-laden roof beams. And yet, somehow, the neighbors kept knocking. It was perhaps the least romantic part of pioneer life, getting out of bed when your breath was visible indoors. Imagine it, wrapped in a wool blanket that scratched like a grizzly bear's hug. You'd peel yourself away from a straw-stuffed mattress, more lump than loft, only to be greeted by a freezing slap of morning air that had absolutely zero regard for your existence. Early settlers often started their days before the sun did, not out of motivation, mind you, but because fire only lasts so long before it turns to ash. You either restarted at dawn with frozen fingers, or you shiver while your eyebrows frost over. A choice between hypothermia and productivity. Quaint, isn't it? Now, windows, if a household had any at all, were not the double-glazed marvels that hum quietly of modern insulation. They were often just oiled paper stretched over wooden frames, not glass, and thus did little more than provide blurry shapes of misery outside. They were mostly decorative lies. Clear panes, when available, were a luxury, and even then would collect frost on the inside, turning your quaint log cabin into a sparkling icebox. It was like living in a snow globe, if snow globes came with rampant toothaches and raccoons under the floorboards. Dressing for such mornings resembled a complicated game of how many layers you could wear before losing circulation. Wool shirts, wool drawers, wool socks, wool everything. If sheep had lawyers, they might have demanded royalties. Buttons were often wooden, because metal ones could betray you with a brutal zap of cold if they touched your skin. There's nothing like armor that turns against its wearer. Then came breakfast, if one could call it that. Porridge. Again, possibly the same porridge as yesterday, boiled anew in a cast-iron cauldron thicker than most family trees. Salt pork sizzled if you were lucky. Butter was a distant dream, gone the moment the churn froze solid. And coffee? Unless you traded for it or grew chicory, you were sipping boiled acorn slurry, trying to pretend your life was still full of dignity. Still, sharing this steaming bowl of hot mush with your family, huddled around a fire that crackled with just enough warmth to thaw the tips of your dreams. There was a kind of peace, a strange quiet survival, held together by stolen warmth and a shared grudge against the universe. The fireplace, the literal heart of the home, was heaped with hardened logs, each one hauled from the forest by sheer muscle and regrettable decisions. Wood was currency in the cold months. Entire days were spent chopping, hauling, stacking, and debating the virtues of bark orientation, all to ensure the fire never died. Without it, well, you didn't just lose your socializing spot. You lost your soup pot, your drying area, your baking oven, your glove warmer, your everything. It was like maintaining a very needy pet that eats trees and pouts in silence when ignored. The fashionably frostbitten trend of the day involved keeping indoor chores to a minimum, or choosing ones that required movement. Some clever folks would hang laundry indoors near the fire so it could dry out and simultaneously serve as insulation. Clotheslines over beds were not uncommon, giving the appearance of sleeping beneath stalactites of wet linens. As for daily work, oh, how winter limited that. Fields were frozen solid, animals were either sleeping or plotting your downfall, and repair work involved hammers so cold they bit back, So settlers spent their time carving tools, mending clothes, and sharing stories, transforming the long nights into makeshift theatrical productions of who suffered the most last year. Remember the blizzard of 11? One might mutter, and the room would fall silent in reverence, or because someone's moustache had frozen to their cup again. Children, meanwhile, were inventively bored, sledding on shovels, drawing questionable animals in the frost on windows, and playing with corn husk dolls that looked like legal drawings of people. No screens, no batteries, only snow, firelight, and the endless creativity that comes from being under house arrest with your extended family. But winter had its hushed wonders. The way snow blanketed everything into softness, silencing the woods outside as if even the trees were sleeping. Icicles caught the candlelight like some frosty chandelier designed by nature's laziest architect, and in those midnight hours, beneath quilts, stacked like tectonic plates of flannel, the world, cold as it was, seemed briefly still. And so, as the fire flickered lower and the snow whispered against the windows, thoughts drifted to the vital matter of staying warm tomorrow. Because winter, as early settlers knew too well, always gave you something to plan for, especially when your mittens had mysteriously acquired a family of mice. And just as dreams begin to stir beneath those woolen havens, so too begins something else, a flicker of warmth somewhere unexpected. History doesn't often mention how socks, yes socks, were once as precious as livestock. But try living in a log cabin in 1740 with frost creeping through every wooden seam like a nosy ghost. And suddenly, those itchy wool tubes become priceless artifacts of survival. Early settlers didn't have central heating. They had sit closer to the fire and hope for the best. As the cold deepened and snow began its long, smug residency across the frontier, each day grew quieter. The winter winds carried rumors through the forest that spring might not visit this year or the next. And so, wrapped in 3 layers of poorly tanned deerskin and existential dread, the settlers braced themselves for what the almanac cheerfully predicted: a winter longer than a Methodist sermon. In New England, where frostbite was practically a seasonal tradition, families huddled together inside their one-room homes. Privacy became as rare as fresh vegetables, and if your brother ground his teeth in his sleep, congratulations. You got to hear the whole concert, nightly. Beds groaned under the collective weight of 8 or 9 bodies burrowed together like squirrels, because when it's -15 and the blanket's made from horsehair and hope, cuddling isn't optional. It's doctrine. When it came to food, settlers enjoyed a culinary palate, ranging from cold and chewy to mysteriously grey. The winter pantry often included dried apples, salted pork, and a grim substance affectionately referred to as pudding, which could mean anything from baked cornmeal to stewed leather if things got desperate. Root cellars offered some salvation. Dark chambers beneath the earth scented with mud, onions, and the quiet sobbing of a cabbage left too long. Candles were hoarded like treasure. Beeswax was limited. So many families turned to tallow, rendered animal fat, producing a flame with the ambience of a melting candle and the aroma of a haunted meatball. Any task done after sunset, from mending socks to reading the family Bible, occurred by the flickering light of this oily luminescence. And if reading by firelight seems romantic, remember they were usually squinting over Leviticus, not a Jane Austen novel. Laundry was an ordeal rarely attempted in winter, lest frozen shirts shatter upon folding, and so cleanliness became negotiable. It was said some folks didn't remove their long johns from November to March. That's 4 months sealed in what can only be described as a historical crockpot of despair. And while we can giggle about it now, those layers were often the best barrier between life and hypothermia. Not to mention the only thing keeping cabin mates at a socially acceptable nose distance apart. Time passed slowly, marked only by the groan of tree limbs and the daily miracle of not succumbing to scurvy. Conversations turned peculiar. People discussed dreams they had 6 weeks ago. One man in Pennsylvania reportedly named each icicle around his doorway and kept a running dialogue with them. Meanwhile, attempts at indoor recreation included whittling, hymn singing, and impersonating chickens to amuse young children. Activities which, incidentally, all escalated dramatically as January wore on. And the boredom, the great howling tundra of nothing to do. With the fields covered in snow and the farm tools resting like cold bones in the shed, people turned inward, journals from the period read like gentle spirals into existential madness. One diary simply read, Day 41, snowed again, ate mush. The cat looked at me with suspicion. Another documented a week-long experiment on how long one could nap without moving more than an eyebrow. Ironically, it was this persistent quiet that cultivated a kind of reflective resilience. Winter wasn't just a test of physical endurance, it was a sharpening stone for the spirit. It required creativity, patience, and the ability to make a game out of counting how many potatoes looked like political figures in bad lighting. Long before Wi-Fi outages and delayed Amazon packages, these winter months demanded that people sit with silence and get to know both their neighbors and their own minds a little too well. As the fire crackled low and night pressed against the frosty windows, the settlers would whisper prayers for spring and listen for the distant cry of a thawing branch, sure signs that their wintry sentence might, at long last, be shortened for good behavior. And as the long night stretched even further, the next test, stealthy and blunt in its arrival, waited at the outer edge of their patience, when even the candles grew tired. If you've never considered the dramatic flair of a colonial chamber pot, you're not alone. But early settlers certainly did, and not by choice. For when snow piled high and winds howled like disappointed Puritans, your options for relieving yourself were slim. You either dashed to the outhouse and risked frostbitten bits, or you employed the services of that humble, often underappreciated artifact of indoor plumbing's prequel, the chamber pot, a ceramic bowl, in the bedroom, on purpose. There's a certain romance to picturing settlers huddled beside a crackling hearth, sipping cider and spinning yarns. But reality frequently replaced cider with desperation and spinning yarns with spinning actual yarn, usually without feeling in your fingers. Knitting by firelight with frozen digits is a lot like writing a novel with mittens on, technically possible, wildly uncomfortable, and likely to result in a dangerously lopsided sock. But sock lopsiding was only one of winter's talents. Let us consider another, spontaneous door freezing. It wasn't uncommon for settlers to awaken to find their front door hugged tightly shut by a frozen embrace of wind-blown snow. The ingenuity needed to escape your own home in the morning could rival that of a prison break. The difference being that the prisoner, at least, hadn't politely invited their captor indoors the night before when they forgot to close the shutters. Homes, if we're being generous, insulated themselves with a mixture of hope and moss. Gaps between logs in a log cabin were sealed with a substance called chinking, sometimes made with a souffle of clay straw, and occasionally, if the family was feeling fancy, horsehair. While effective at keeping out a light draft, It had as much success blocking out subarctic gales as a laced doily would have fending off a charging moose. Inside, the hearth reigned supreme. Fire was your primary source of heat, light, and food, including breakfast, which in colder months was often some poor old root still clinging to relevance. Potatoes, onions, perhaps a reluctant turnip, all of them stored for months in cellar darkness, waiting their turn in a pot of something grimly termed winter stew. It was hearty, yes, but also deeply suspicious. There are still descendants out there who swear their ancestors survived entire Februaries eating nothing but beige stew and stubborn optimism. Clothing, while a valiant effort against the elements, was less about fashion and more about layering until you resembled a human laundry pile. Sleeping in a nightcap wasn't just quaint. Your ears could actually snap off if left uncovered. Woolen long johns, when paired with foot wrappings, formed what we today might call sleepwear, and what they likely called the last clean things. And bedding, oh the cold comfort of early bedding, was whatever you could stuff inside a ticking. Feathers if you were well off, straw if you weren't, and corn husk if you had recently annoyed your local blacksmith and couldn't borrow better. Blankets were layered thickly, sometimes so much so that getting out of bed felt akin to lifting the roof to say good morning. Still, let us not overlook the strangest miracle of those long frozen nights. Entertainment. No Netflix, no phones, no ironic board games. Just stories. Folks sat by the fire, mouths breathing fog indoors, and recited family legends, tall tales, and the occasional ghost story. Because what better time to introduce the devil's footprints than when your windows have collected their own indoor frost? They relied on their mouths and their memories. And if stories didn't do the trick, there was reading, assuming your ink hadn't frozen and your candle hadn't guttered out from the breeze sneaking in through the cracks in your moss. Young Abigail might read by firelight with the family Bible, one of the few books present, learning of parables while waiting for the wind to quiet so she could maybe hear her own thoughts again. As the stars gazed silently over a snowy roof and a world blanketed in silence, early families pressed closer to one another. Out of love, yes, but mostly out of necessity. When heating came by log and laughter and a bit of prayer, every night meant trusting that dawn would show its face through the frost. As the night deepens and our early American hearth flickers low, we turn gently toward the other half of survival. How settlers fed themselves when winter's breath swept the land clean of green. We'll find ourselves in cellars and smokehouses next, peering into pantries packed with both promise and preservation. It was one thing to prepare for winter by stacking cords of firewood and curing ham until it resembled something between jerky and geological sediment. But it was something else entirely to make it through the long winter nights when the hearth had gone quiet. The candle stub was dwindling, and the world outside had frozen its voice beneath 3 feet of snow. Evenings became their own kind of test for early settlers. After supper, usually a steaming mystery stew with vague aspirations of flavor, starring root vegetables and a ham bone that everyone politely refused to give up on, time itself began to stretch. Without clocks, without screens, and with only candlelight standing between them and sheer blackness, settlers entered what can only be called the Great Pondering Hour. This hour began when someone asked, "What day is it again?" and ended whenever Papa decided the stew had sufficiently digested and kicked off the family storytelling with his legendary, and probably unverifiable, tale of wrestling a bear over mustard. Rations. He won, of course. The bear fled out of respect for tradition. Books were rare. The ones that existed were simultaneously sacred and suspiciously sticky from little hands or molasses emergencies. So instead, oral tradition ruled the winter. Stories passed from one generation to the next, embellished, massaged, occasionally fictionalized to make Grandpa look braver than he perhaps had been. There's no written record confirming that Grandma Hester punched a raven for stealing her laundry, but you tell that story on a cold evening once and it becomes gospel. Winter's true test wasn't the cold, nor the snow, nor the thrice-weekly nose freezes. It was monotony. It slid into the day like a snowfall so silent you didn't notice it until it buried everything. Days felt like echoes of themselves. The same firewood stack, the same grumpy cow, the same mittens you lost and then found inside your own sleeve. To fight the yawning sameness, settlers invented modest rituals. One New England family reportedly combated boredom by building tiny chairs for mice. Another household in the Hudson Valley set aside a singing candle, not because it sang, but because you weren't allowed to hum or invent songs unless that particular candle was burning. It burned often. Children invented games with limited resources and practically no safety standards. Ice sledding, just hold on to the back of a goat. Indoor tag, excellent, until someone crashed headfirst into the butter churn and found themselves an unwilling pioneer of dairy-based hair products. Crocheting, knitting, whittling. These were not hobbies in winter. They were lifelines. Stabbing at wool with 2 sticks became the only socially acceptable way to fend off existential dread. And if you messed up and one mitten came out the size of a canoe while the other resembled a thimble, you just blamed old patterns and carried on. Surprisingly, laughter was the other unannounced guest of the Long's winter. Humorous remarks gained gravity, partly because there was so little competition. If your cousin made a joke about a chicken walking backward to relive summer, it earned a place in the family canon, right alongside serious Bible verses and dried apple storage techniques. Chuckles warmed the soul faster than even mulled cider did, especially if the cider had fermented more eagerly than intended. And perhaps that was one reason these early settlers endured. Not because they were tougher, though yes, they did handle frostbite like it was just a complicated form of blushing, but because they leaned heavily on ritual, imagination, and the occasional spontaneous fiddle performance when morale dipped. Many nights, they sat quietly together. Not in silence exactly, but in a shared pause, listening to the wood crackle, to the wind whisper secrets through the eaves, to the baby chewing determinedly on the family Bible, possibly seeking wisdom or just something saltier than boiled parsnips. Winter didn't end so much as loosen its grip. A day would arrive when the snow looked more grey than white, and the chickens attempted half-hearted squawks. Hope tiptoed back in, and yet, before any thaw, they had to pass one more hurdle in the settler winter gauntlet. Supplies running low just when winter's endurance round truly began. But that, dear dreamer, is another fireside story all its own. As winter deepened its grip on the wooden corners of colonial cottages, a particularly cruel domestic menace began to rear its sleepy-eyed head. Boredom. Yes, not frostbite, not famine, but boredom. The cold weather companion that crept like a draft through hand-hewn walls and thumped like a squirrel in the rafters. With fields frozen and roads turned into glorified ice chutes, early settlers found themselves locked in what might best be described as a seasonal standoff with monotony. Time, once spent ploughing fields and tending livestock, now slowed to the fluttering pace of candlelight. And when you're huddled indoors with the same 6 people for months on end, Even the most beloved spouse can begin to talk just a bit too much about turnip storage techniques. Long evenings offered little in the way of structured entertainment. No radio, no books for most, and certainly no reliable way to binge-watch outdated cooking shows for comfort. Instead, colonial families employed that most primitive of coping mechanisms: storytelling. Around the hearth, tales of ghosts, witches, and occasionally slightly haunted goats were spun with wild flourishes to enliven the creaking hours. It was a pastime that required no equipment, just a good memory, a flair for drama, and a tolerance for being interrupted by Aunt Martha's facts about chimney design. Game nights, too, made their modest presence known. Long before Monopoly could end friendships, settlers played games like drafts, fox and geese, or, if you had a spare kernel of corn and a flat table, some form of marbles. Dice were sometimes carved from bone, which was a charmingly unsettling way to gamble your rations away. And let us not forget the many creative arts that emerged, not from inspiration, but desperation. Whittling became less of a craft and more of a nervous habit. Entire families developed elaborate wooden spoon collections, not out of culinary necessity, but simply because there was nothing else to do between dusk and dawn. Quilting bees may sound cozy now, but imagine stitching the 1,000th hexagon while your cousin sings, once again, his 3-verse ode to boiled cabbage. Children, never famed for their subtlety in any century, often churned up their own brand of chaos. Indoors for days on end, they invented new and thrilling strategies for stair sledding, table fort engineering, and the always controversial, let's put the chicken in the bed and see what happens. Their parents, driven to distraction, sometimes invented chores on the spot. Thus was born the practice of sweeping the loft dust in case it gets ideas. And looming in the background, exuding its own quiet dread, was the need to ration. Every cracker, every curl of rendered fat, every suspiciously darkened apple in the bin had its fate debated like matters of state. Spices, if they existed, were used as though they were powdered gold. A fleck of cinnamon could inspire polite war. This led to culinary creativity that dazzled almost no one, with dishes like boiled breadcrumbs, turnip tea, and the ever-infamous mystery pottage, which neither confirmed nor denied the involvement of last year's salted beaver. Of course, spiritual life endured among the tedium. The Bible, one of the few texts many families possessed, was read aloud, not just for inspiration, but for the joy of the language itself. Its chapters filled the room with a rhythm that matched the crackle of the fire, and its messages were not overwhelmed by genealogies of who begat whom, gave settlers a sense of perseverance amidst the slowness of the season. Neighbors, if reachable through snarled drifts and ice-crusted paths, were visited with tremendous fanfare. A 10-mile sleigh trip to someone else's cold, smoky house was considered downright glamorous. Bundled in layers of wool, fur, and prayer, they crossed icy fields just to enjoy someone else's sourdough and hear if the rumors about someone's cow learning to open the barn latch were really true. And still, as night poured down over cabin roofs and icy branches clicked like skeletal fingers, the quiet returned. Winter let no one forget who was in charge, but the settlers endured it with a mix of grit, invention, and a strange delight in making do. Between the tales of shadowy woods, the nervous scraping of winter meals, and the mildly hallucinogenic effects of eating too much preserved rhubarb, they found ways to inhabit both time and space, even as both threatened to fall asleep under a blanket of snow. But of all the trials winter could throw their way, There was one that crept into stockings and rifled through firewood like an unwelcome guest. The tireless, itchy, unsettling realm of winter pests. As winter pressed on like a guest who refused to take the hint, early settlers found themselves increasingly at odds with their surroundings, and occasionally with their own livestock. The cows, being generally unenthusiastic about having icy beards and freezing udders, developed the unique ability to glare. Chickens stopped laying eggs out of what one can only assume was either protest or sheer emotional drama. For settlers, though, the real trial of winter wasn't just cold feet or soggy firewood. It was the complete and oppressively ordinary act of staying alive. Let's picture a modest log cabin, nestled somewhere deep in the frosted woods of what we'd now call Vermont, though at the time it may as well have been Siberia with sassafras. Within its moss-chinked walls, a small family huddles near the hearth, a fire crackling with both warmth and a sense of barely contained desperation. Food is rationed, not in a trendy, minimalist way, but in a we're down to 4 potatoes and a squirrel named Reginald kind of way. The larder that had groaned pleasantly with autumn's harvest now boomed with echoes. Preserves, made in great sticky enthusiasm back in September, were now guarded like treasure. Jars of strawberries seemed like forbidden gems, too beautiful and rare to open. One could only look at them wistfully between bites of boiled turnip and existential dread. The problem wasn't just scarcity, it was repetition. In the absence of spice and inspiration, every meal became drastically similar to the last. Salt pork, for instance. A delicacy, perhaps, if you live on a pirate ship or are incredibly fond of chewing leather. But day after day, week after chilly week, salt pork began to lose its charm. Children would dream of apples, just apples. No pie, no sauce, no cinnamon. Just that crisp, juicy bite remembered by hearts and molars alike. Then there were the chores. You might think a snow-covered world would mean less outdoor labor, but nature had other plans. Wood had to be chopped again, split into kindling, then begged to become fire in stony hearths that refused to cooperate until someone muttered a desperate prayer to St. Sparkalot. Water had to be drawn from creeks or wells half frozen, the buckets so cold they could bite, the ice so stubborn it might as well have been a minor deity. Yet amidst these trials, our weary settlers invented a very special form of entertainment: winter storytelling. With nothing new to report and no one coming to visit unless absolutely forced, the only amusement came from rehashing the family's favorite tales. Father might recount, for the 17th night in a row, the time he fought off a bear using only a broom and the righteous fear of his mother-in-law. The children listened with shining eyes and skeptical snorts, while mother quietly stitched by candlelight, knowing full well the bear was actually a raccoon with identity issues. Storytelling was more than just passing time. It was the glue between generations, weaving memory into myth and hardship into something resembling humor. There, snug beneath patchwork quilts made from every shirt ever worn into a hole, the family rebuilt spirits with words and warm breath fogging the air. Outside, the wind sighed through leafless trees, singing its old song of survival. Animals burrowed and hibernated. Snow drifted lazily, as if it had nowhere particular to be. And even in their weariness, the settlers watched it fall with a kind of resigned awe. The bleak beauty of winter could be cruel, yes, but also magnificent in ways that made the soul sit still. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, glinting in moonlight like chandeliers for foxes. A hush cloaked the world, interrupted only by the sharp crack of frozen branches or the soft complaints of weathered shutters. It was in this deep quiet that something curious began to happen. The mind, no longer distracted by fields, fences, and neighbors shouting about whose pig ate whose turnip, had room to think, to philosophize even. One might ponder the ethics of snowshoe theft, or why mittens never seem to dry all the way, the pressing questions of frontier existence. But most of all, they began to plan, not only for spring, but for survival that stretched beyond mere existence. They made tiny ambitions: quilt more, complain less, save one jar of strawberry preserves purely for celebration, live a little, somewhere between the frost and the patience it required. And so, tucked away from the cold and the silence, our settlers waited, with thought, with fire, with salted pork and slightly exaggerated bear stories, until the storm grew tired of its theatrics. Now, as dim starlight spreads gently across snow-laden hills, we drift toward another quiet marvel of early winter life, the curious case of indoor fashion choices, because nothing says survival quite like wearing 3 trousers and a teapot cozy as a hat. If the early settlers had a motto for wintertime, it might have been something like, well, that probably could have gone better. And indeed, as twilight fell across the snow-covered cabins and teeth chattered in harmony with kettles rattling on the hearth, our frostbitten forebears continued to learn, often the hard way, that surviving a season meant more than just being stubborn. It was a delicate waltz between patience, preparation, and the uniquely human ability to pretend everything is fine when in fact the roof is leaking and the last potato has been boiled twice for flavor. By now, winter wasn't just a visitor. It was an uninvited house guest, sprawled across every plank and rafter, snoring heavily and tracking muddy snow across the clean floor of human optimism. With the days squeezed into paltry mouthfuls of grey light and nights stretching long as the Mississippi, the settlers turned increasingly inward, both in their homes and their minds. Inside cramped log cabins, entire families lived closer than sardines would ever dream of. Privacy was a myth whispered about, like dragons or warm weather. If someone managed to carve out a moment of solitude, it was likely because they were in the outhouse. And even then, there were no guarantees. And thus rose one of winter's cruelest quirks, the long months of forced domestic intimacy. Outside, trees stood like cold skeletons. Inside, tempers bubbled just beneath the cinnamon-scented surface. Games were invented, often in desperation. Clap and count, a riveting pastime involving clapping and, yes, counting, was surprisingly popular, as was Guess What I'm Thinking, which often ended in hurt feelings and long silences. Food remained a delicate matter. By January, the larder had begun to look like a cupboard auditioning for a role in a sad poem. Salted pork, if there was any left, had become a breakfast luxury, a dinner dream, and a recurring argument between spouses. You ate the last piece. No, I saw you give it to the dog. The dog is dead, Martha. Ah, winter. Still, every so often, there came a spark, a glimmer of human inventiveness that refused to be snowed in. Root cellars dug deep into frozen earth months before, now revealed miraculous bounty. Turnips, those pale princes of subterranean produce, made their frigid debut. Parsnips had their moment too, briefly basking in applause before being quietly returned to the stew pot. And let us not forget dried apples, fruity, chewy memories of kinder seasons, tucked in beside a few raisins, which somehow never seemed to soften, no matter how long they were stewed. Community was another survival mechanism, like mittens or fur hats or selective hearing. Neighbors staggered through snowdrifts to visit one another, bearing gifts of dried beans or news of a particularly lovely icicle. The social currency of the season included singing ballads, storytelling, and complaining about how it had never been this cold before. Spoiler, it absolutely had. Yet for all their drifting days and frozen fingers, the settlers found moments of genuine magic. Ice glimmered on every window pane in moody filigree, as if winter itself fancied calligraphy. At night, with wind howling like a restless ghost, people gathered close under bearskins, telling old stories made new with each retelling. Firelight flickered across wide eyes and ruddy cheeks, and outside, the stars crackled like diamonds cooling in the sky. And then, there was the mail. When it arrived, it was like treasure. Crumpled letters with smudged ink and sweet hints of lives beyond the valley's grip. One time, a message from back east shared that barn cats had taken over the mayor's chair during a meeting. It was unclear whether that was symbolic or simply cold municipal fact. Either way, it lifted hearts. And now, just as the snow began to crust with sun-hardened sheen, and the corners of rooftops gave slow, resigned drips, a sound. Not the wind, not the crack of firewood, but a low, far-off jingle. Not bells exactly, but certainly something metallic. Could it be sleigh runners, or something stranger? A signal, perhaps, of what came next, as answers creaked into the edge of the frostbitten horizon. Somewhere between the crackling silence of lightly falling snow and the muffled clink of frost-covered wood, early settlers braced themselves for what might generously be called seasonal character development. Winter had arrived, not with the joyful jingle promised by modern holiday songs, but with a kind of stern parental energy, as if the entire landscape had decided it was time to teach everyone a good, long lesson in humility. By the midpoint of winter, even the most optimistic souls had gotten thoroughly acquainted with the nuances of cold. Not just cold, mind you, but a living, breathing presence that seeped in under doors, through the chinks in log walls, and right into your soul while you were trying to make tea with frozen leaves and regrets. One particularly vivid enemy was the outhouse. Ah, yes, the icy porcelain sentinel at the edge of the woods. Every settler had a story about that one January night when they had to visit it, and the seat was, let's just say, less than agreeable. It was a deeply personal betrayal, one that could test faith, marriage, and the laws of thermodynamics, all in the same trip. But it wasn't just the discomfort that wore people down. It was the relentless monotony wrapped in wool and waiting. Days blurred into one another, coated in shades of ash grey and stale biscuit beige. With the rivers frozen and farm work halted, families were left to engage in endless rounds of not freezing. Pastimes included stirring soup, re-knitting socks that unraveled themselves out of spite, and poking the fire thoughtfully while pretending you weren't planning to barter your cousin's violin for a lump of coal. Yet, amidst this glacial swirl of survival and slow-motion domesticity, there were stories, moments when the human spirit, dusty but unbroken, pressed its cold little nose against the frosted window of ingenuity. Take, for example, the noble sport of snow shovel races, invented by unpaid teenagers desperate for diversion and a better seating rotation near the hearth. A basic model was simply, sit on a snow shovel and fling yourself downhill. But, as with most human innovation, things escalated. Before long, sleds were built from barrel lids, and the local record for least dignified downhill dismount was the stuff of community legend. Injuries were minor, Pride, less so. Card games were another winter institution, often conducted with rules that changed mysteriously whenever Aunt Mabel started losing. Children grew up believing the Queen of Hearts had special powers in rural cabins, mostly because she seemed to win hands she wasn't part of. And then there was candle making, equal parts necessity, art, and pungent ordeal. Tallow, lovingly rendered from animal fat, was melted in great pots and poured into moulds, often by anyone too small to chop wood, but too fidgety to sit still. The result? Candles that burned poorly and smelled like last season's sausages. But they were light, and that alone made them more valuable than gold-covered raisins, which, incidentally, was something one settler actually tried to invent. Hardship tended to shrink the world into cozier circles. Stories got told, retold, then remixed with dramatic flair until Paul the Barber became Paul the Badger Wrestler. Children listened wide-eyed, parents sipped smoky tea, or something pretending to be tea, and the long winter hummed quietly around it all. Now and then, a travelling neighbour might brave the snow and arrive with news from 3 cabins away, or a potato no one remembered planting, and suddenly the cabin felt less like a snow-drifted exile and more like the bustling centre of a very small, very chilly universe. Yes, winter was unforgiving, but it was also the season when people leaned into their eccentricities. Mrs. Whittaker took up indoor hat making, though she refused to explain why all her hats had only one ear flap. Mr. Johnson sang lullabies to his pickles. They say it improved the brine. Odd? Certainly. Creative? Absolutely. Endearing? Without question. Because when the wind howled like a lonely tax collector and your only neighbour was a snow-covered pine tree named Stan, you did what humans have always done. You adapted and got a little weirder than strictly necessary. And as February froze the door latch shut once again, the settlers began to sense that winter, like all tyrants, would eventually tire of itself and wander off. But for now, they returned to their candlelight, their card games, and their slightly smoky tea, and waited for the stirrings of something softer in the snow. Softly, the days creaked forward, and with them, strange discoveries emerged from the ice. While spring promised mud and blossoms, and summer bragged with overly aggressive sunshine, winter brought with it a very specific flavour of humility. It was the season most likely to unlace a settler's bootstraps, both metaphorically and quite literally, because buckles, while fashionable, are no match for frostbite and several feet of snow. As the bitter months rolled across the countryside, early colonists didn't so much fight the cold as attempt to negotiate with it, often by piling on every article of clothing they owned and murmuring quiet apologies to their toes. Houses were technically shelters in the way a paper hat is technically a roof. Cold seeped through gaps in rough-hewn wood, whistled through chinks in the daub and wattle, and left a thin layer of rime on the inside. Yes, inside of windows. The fireplace, though romantic in novels, served less like a warm companion and more like a petty tyrant. Sit too close and you'd risk blistering. Too far and you'd wonder if hypothermia had a setting called slow roast. And still, it was the centre of life, casting flickering shadows of hope and sizzling rabbit stew. But food. Ah yes, food. Winter cuisine had a certain minimalistic charm. If by charm we mean scraping the last of the pickled onions out of a barrel while pretending parsnips were an acceptable lifestyle choice. Early settlers faced the unique challenge of preserving ingredients months in advance, based on nothing but guesswork and desperate optimism. An overly enthusiastic summer feast could result in a very hungry March. Preservation methods were creative and at times slightly alarming. Cabbages were buried in root cellars next to sacks of turnips and something that might once have been a pear. Meat was salted until it could legally identify as a mineral. Anything smoked remained slightly flammable. And everything, absolutely everything, took on a curious flavor best described as earthy, with notes of desperation. Then there were the chores. Winter chores were never ending, and usually involved wrestling with ice, firewood, or occasionally livestock that had developed contempt for doors. Hauling wood, feeding animals, chipping frozen water from troughs, all daily activities performed while wrapped in more layers than a puff pastry. And yet, community endured. In the heart of the frost, neighbors helped neighbors, not just out of kindness, but because borrowing firewood was easier than hauling it, and gossip traveled faster in tight quarters. Winter gatherings were small, smoky, and ever so slightly fermented. Quilting circles doubled as political forums. Every story told beside the hearth was repeated at least 5 times, a combination of poor memory, poor hearing, or the simple joy of storytelling. Children, meanwhile, possessed a baffling immunity to the cold. While adults muttered dark oaths into cups of weak tea, children hurled themselves down icy hillsides with astonishing speed and no regard for personal safety. Their snowball fights were cheerful affairs, occasionally interrupted when someone got hit with a bit too much enthusiasm and had to go sit by the fire until their nose stopped bleeding and their pride thawed. Letters from distant relatives read aloud offered either comfort or renewed anxiety. A cousin back in England had invested in a greenhouse and could grow lemons year-round. Bitter news best delivered with tact. A married sister in the next village reported 12 children and standing room only church services, which was either an inspiration or a horror story, depending on personal feelings about hymnals and crowding. Religious services and Sunday reflections gave many settlers a sense of purpose during these monochrome months. Churches, while not known for their insulation, became sanctuaries of whispered prayers and creaky wooden pews, a place where warmth came more from shared faith than from actual degrees of Fahrenheit. Time itself played strange tricks in winter. Days were short, but seemed to stretch like old molasses. Nights, lingering and wind-bitten, became the ideal setting for quiet contemplation, or rewriting last year's sea catalogue with unearned ambition. And so it went. Winter, for settlers, was less a season and more a test of patience, of endurance, and of one's willingness to eat boiled squash out of a clay pot and pretend it was nourishing. Some nights, as the wind curled around the eaves like a cat made of knives, a settler might toss another log on the fire, sip something vaguely warm, and wonder, was this all manageable because of grit, or just the human habit of adapting until we forget what warmth used to feel like? In the still hush of snowlight and candle glow, one could almost believe spring was just around the bend. Almost. And just like that, on shoes half mended and spirits half full, the days inched forward toward another frostbitten sunrise and another peculiar pattern of survival, where, in the company of woolen socks and stubborn hearts, even the bleakest mornings hinted, faintly, at hope. Which brings us to a rather curious issue involving chamber pots, ill-timed blizzards, and a very inconvenient outhouse. The fire had long since settled into a bed of glowing embers, and in the tiny frontier cabin, moonlight filtered through frost-laced panes, scattering silver across rough-hewn timbers. Outside, winter held its breath, as if unwilling to release even one gust of wind for fear of shattering the stillness. But let's drift, together, back toward the heart of a midwinter night in the 18th century, a time when Americans still debated whether a second pair of socks qualified as luxury or downright gluttony. Inside these early colonial cabins, daily life was a careful ballet of survival, adaptation, and the occasional goose-related accident. The hearth was the nucleus of existence. By day, it was the kitchen stove, dryer, therapy lamp, and, depending on how long the preacher's sermon had gone, the seat of mild rebellion. By night, it was a warm-hearted ember guardian, clinging to warmth like a toddler to a favorite blanket. Every plank in the house, likely cut and raised by the very family sleeping within, groaned as if speaking the ancient language of cold wood. And above those sleepy heads, sometimes literally above, as it was not uncommon for families to hang food in sacks from ceiling beams halfway between pantry and prey, we find a curious truth. Winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an annual exam of a family's planning, patience, and ability to give up all hope of bathing until spring. Bathing, in fact, was regarded with deep suspicion by many colonial Americans during winter. A full wash could require not only hauling and heating gallons of water, but also the strength to remove 6 layers of garments, only to find yourself wondering if your toes had always looked that blue. Many opted for the art of the sponge bath, although sponges, at the time, were more likely to be scraps of wool, moss, or good intentions. To endure these long months required more than just firewood and salted pork. It took remarkable creativity with boredom management. Imagine no Netflix, no podcasts, and certainly no cozy sleep story narrators. What did winter settlers do to pass the hours between dusk and dawn, which, in January, are practically the same? They read, if they had books. They whittled, if they had wood. They mended socks with thread spun from regret and cat hair, and sometimes, yes, they told stories. Ah, the winter tale, that trusty ancestral pastime. Around the fire, wrapped in layers thicker than most modern throw blankets, settlers spun tales that mingled faith, folklore, and frostbite. One might hear about the ghost of a long-dead cart horse, still heard trotting along the lane late at night, or of Granny Jones, who fought off a hungry bear with nothing but her glare in a ladle. Children nestled beneath quilt mountains listened with wide, unblinking eyes. Perhaps this explains so many of the period's stern portraits. Somewhere in the folds of family storytelling, fact, fiction, and seasonal legacy blurred into a dreamlike midwinter fog. But survival wasn't all firelight and folklore. Practical heroism abounded, particularly in the monotonous realm of snow removal. Without modern plows or even halfway decent boots, clearing paths became a collective act of determination. They would leverage crude brooms, half-barrel sleds, or, as was the case in some northern settlements, simply give up and wait for spring to return the roads. Food, as ever, played a starring role in winter life. Root cellars were raided nightly like sacred tombs, yielding turnips that had survived since autumn, or potatoes that had achieved unnervingly humanoid shapes in their slumber. Winter meals were hearty out of necessity, not because 18th century cooks were feeling indulgent, but because one does tend to require 4,000 calories a day when you're constantly being outwitted by your own fireplace. And yet, in all of this, through the smoke-scented wool mittens, the flint and tinder battles, the bootfuls of slush and the songs half sung to keep spirits up, there was something else brewing under the frost. A communal endurance, an unspoken pact between neighbor and kin. We will outlast the snow, We will not let the pickles run out. We will figure out what's making that weird noise in the attic in April. But before that glorious thaw comes, before the rivers turn back from glass to laughter, our settlers must face one more obstacle: the fine art of heating things. Not just homes, no. We're talking beds, pots, hands, ink, and even, dare we say it, feet. And so, gently now, let us lean deeper into the warmth of firelit winter nights, where tomorrow's hopes flicker softly alongside the coals. While winter in the colonies was often a battle against frostbitten toes and dwindling food stores, it also found ways to quietly shuffle into the more peculiar corners of daily life. Take, for example, the curious case of the colonial outhouse. Perhaps not the most glamorous slice of history, but no less vital, especially when the temperature dropped below freezing and you suddenly became very aware that your toilet was 50 yards from the warmth of the hearth. You see, early settlers weren't yet blessed with insulated plumbing or porcelain seats pre-warmed by electricity and modern luxury. No, nature called in December just as it did in June, though considerably less politely. And so began the winter march, boots crunching over snowy paths, scarf pulled over the nose, candle lantern lighting the way like a flickering tribute to warmer latrines past. These chilly excursions were performed with grim determination, and, one imagines, the occasional muttered oath to whatever poor soul in the village designed the privy so far from the cabin. Some settlers tried insulating their outhouses with straw, rags, or thick hides, giving them the look of shivering thatched huts pleading for mercy under the snow. Others simply held everything in until spring, which, for digestive comfort, was probably not the recommended approach. But the cold didn't stop at the door. Inside the dwellings themselves, winter was an uninvited house guest, one who refused to sit quietly in the parlor, instead storming through chinks in the logs, whispering up through gaps in the floorboards, and throwing tantrums down the chimney. When snowstorms arrived, they often blew straight into bed with you. Literally, roofs leaked, shutters creaked, and even tightly, woven feather beds offered only a noble defense against the nightly battle with below-zero gusts. To compensate, families layered not just their clothes, but also their sleep arrangements. Children, grandparents, cousins, and even the family dog, who probably had seniority, all nestled together in one bed. There's a charming intimacy to that, history's version of a weighted blanket, though it's likely at least one person in every household was gently nudged off the edge and onto the floor by midnight's end. As for food, winter brought with it a culinary minimalism that would make a modern Instagram chef weep. Meals consisted of what had been smoked, pickled, salted, or, if fortune smiled, root salad back in October. Potatoes grew sprouting eyes, onions took on personalities, and salt pork became the unofficial mascot of winter survival. It was a season seasoned heavily with making do, and tea, that sweet, bitter miracle. Even when supplies ran low, settlers clung to warm drinks like cherished friends. When proper tea leaves became scarce during periods of trade interruption or revolutionary tantrums, they turned to local substitutes, Yaupon holly, sassafras, or even pine needle infusions. A bit woodsy in flavor, perhaps, but fiercely caffeinated and mysteriously invigorating. If one closed their eyes, it almost took the spirit back to more civilized sips and salons. Then there were the boots, stiff, cracked leather, soaked through and refrozen by midday. Whenever a family could afford it, someone was appointed the nightly job of stuffing the children's shoes with warm stones or hot ash wrapped in cloth. pretending it was insulation rather than just a desperate wish for the souls not to be found frozen to the floor come morning. And woe to the poor soul who walked through a snowdrift, only to discover mid-thigh that their boots lacked waterproofing of any kind. Yet through it all, through creaking beams, quiet shivers, and the endlessly grey skies, settlers found strange and tender resilience. They told stories by firelight, hummed forgotten tunes, carved wooden trinkets, and even began jotting letters to no one in particular. Words scraped onto birch bark or dimly penciled in ledger margins, not for record or message, but simply to stay connected to that part of themselves that dreamed a little, even while fingers were too numb to feel the pen. In a world stripped down to necessities, the luxuries of imagination and humour somehow gained greater weight. If spring was a promise, winter was the poem one read to believe in that promise again. A scratchy, cold-footed, poetically inconvenient poem, but a poem nonetheless. And just as the shadows of February began to stretch a bit longer each afternoon, someone would smile faintly from under the covers and say, "I think I heard a bird this morning," which of course was often just the wind. But sometimes, just sometimes, it wasn't. Soon the settlers would reckon with another kind of winter challenge, not the cold itself, but what cold did to communities when patience wore thin. But that's a worry best left for another firelit night. The wind had a way of reasserting dominance just after dusk. Chimneys whistled conspiratorially. Settler cabins, cobbled together from pine and desperation, shuddered like stoic old men wrapped in too thin blankets. The early North American winter wasn't a season so much as a 6-month duel between human stubbornness and nature's chilling sense of humour. By the time midwinter rolled around, the novelty of snow had long melted into drudgery, ironically, despite the snow itself refusing to melt. And as any settler would tell you, warmth came in 3 forms: firewood, livestock proximity, and a long string of unintelligible muttering to distract yourself while chopping more firewood. In fact, chopping firewood became less an act of survival and more a form of seasonal therapy. Settler journals from the 18th century are peppered with emotionally charged wood-related entries. Lines like, "Chopped near 12 cords today," "My hands, gone numb as my dreams," or, "If I ever see another log, I may marry it for warmth." To the modern listener, such expressions might seem dramatic, but when mornings began at -12 and your socks were more whole than wool, small theatrics were perhaps a settler's only reliable fuel. Now, let's not forget the livestock, faithful companions of survival and occasional roommates. Cows, for instance, doubled as barn heaters. If hay supplies ran low, they might also double as dinner, though this was typically a last resort, or at least done out of earshot of the other animals. Chickens, meanwhile, were known to be surprisingly loyal bedfellows, roosting on sleeping settlers like feathered hot water bottles. Probably not what anyone had in mind when they wrote "cozy winter cottage," but needs must. Cleaning was another winter activity, though only because humans are not naturally fond of filth-induced disease. Housekeeping took the form of beating carpets, airing out straw mattresses on the 2 sunny days of January, and arguing about whose turn it was to scrub the chamber pot. Suffice it to say, anyone arguing too loudly risked being assigned the task unironically. Food became both a science and an art. Salt pork, dried beans, and hardtack, aka the original toothbreaker biscuit, formed the base of the winter diet. If a meal splashed with joy, it was likely because someone had boiled a turnip with feeling. The real delicacy came in the form of maple syrup, which, when poured on fresh snow, created a chewy candy that was part treat, part jaw training. Significantly less sweet was the reality of winter illnesses. Colds swooped through settlements like guests overstaying their welcome. And because medicine at the time was roughly as advanced as a traveling fortune teller, remedies wavered between the hopeful and outright suspicious. Onion poultices were popular. Mustard plasters, essentially spicy wallpaper pasted to your chest, were another. One might argue the real cure was distraction, and possibly wine. Amid all this, social rituals crept back in around the edges, like ivy claiming a stone wall. Snow made travel nearly impossible, which introduced the delightful practice of bundling. This involved courting couples being sewn into the same bed, fully clothed, with a board between them, likely constructed by a very skeptical parent. The moral line was drawn somewhere between intimacy and hypothermia. Long winters also brought something else: stories, with darkness descending by late afternoon and candles at a premium. Storytelling filled the frozen margins of time. Tales of old countries, of ship journeys, of supernatural goings-on in the nearby woods. Even the most hardened settler had a ghost story at hand, usually involving the groan of timbers and a lantern that moved by itself. Many wound up blaming raccoons, but they would only admit it after sunrise. The many months of biting cold, bleak skies, and frozen everything tested the resolve of the entire communities. Yet somehow, between spoonfuls of grey soup and sleepless, quilt-heavy nights, laughter returned in faint echoes. Settlers didn't survive winter just through grit. No, they defied it through stubborn humour and the small, ridiculous joys that melted frost from the soul, if not the windows. And each evening, with candles guttering low and boots piled near the hearth, they settled into the peculiar peace of midwinter, a quiet born not of comfort, but of enduring yet one more day. As the wind whispered past the chimney and cabin logs groaned softly under the pressure of frost, another challenge loomed, not of snow, but of spirit. When the snowdrifts came creeping up to the windowsills, early settlers turned their homes into something between a cozy retreat and a fortified snowbank. Winter was not approached so much with joy as with a kind of resigned negotiation, like hosting a long, cold relative who always overstayed their welcome and never remembered to bring biscuits. By January, the world outside their cabins was a theatre of silence. Snow softened the sounds of the forest. Trees cracked like old joints in the frost, and the wind had lost its voice, rolling instead as a low whisper between branches heavy with ice. Indoors, everything was scented with firewood sap and slow-cooked beans. A space no larger than a chicken coop had to house not just people, but their hopes, their tools, and occasionally a sheep or two who needed supervised warming. Winter diplomacy extended to all corners of settler life. Sharing was not optional, it was strategic. There are recorded instances where neighbors gathered in one home for days under the pretense of a weather visit, part social call, part survival maneuver. These visits often featured communal mending of clothes, dramatic storytelling, and group threats aimed at uncooperative stoves. Speaking of stoves, those iron-bellied beasts rarely heated more than a 5-foot radius. Settlers developed what one might call warming choreography. Rotate toward the stove like a roast on a spit, then retreat before your socks began to smoke. Children learned to sleep in bundles, like hedgehog piles, wrapped in woolen sheets and dreams of May. To pass the time, folks returned to older, less interactive forms of entertainment. Reading by candlelight was popular, though it invariably led to unintentionally setting the curls of your neighbor on fire or dozing off into the ink-smudged bosom of a book. Journals from the time are filled with riveting observations like "snowed again today," "lost the thimble," and "is it spring yet?" The food situation was, frankly, a culinary dare. Most meals by February bore a resemblance to regret. Salt pork, dried peas, and the ever-trusty hardtack, which could double as home defense if swung with sufficient enthusiasm. Anything resembling freshness was long gone, unless you had an onion braided from the rafters like an herbal chandelier. If you did, you were basically aristocracy. Winter also brought frostbite and frozen pipe dreams. Boots were stuffed with hay, then with feet, then with prayers. Mittens were not so much warm as they were spiritually comforting. And still, they worked. These hearty souls who muscled through winter with little more than pluck, a pot of mush, and a determination that bordered on unreasonable. The psychological toll of being snowbound for months can't be overstated. Cabin fever was not a metaphor, it was an annual feature. Some families invented games. Others dug intricate decorative tunnels between buildings and claimed it was for ventilation. There are even tales of a man teaching himself to yodel just to break the silence, though his neighbors cordially asked him to unlearn it by spring. Time itself seemed to stretch like maple taffy. Days were short. Nights were marathon sessions of blanket adjusting and listening intently to the sound of the roof groaning under yet another dump of snow. If you've ever waited for sourdough to rise while watching paint dry and listening to Gregorian chants in slow motion, you have a grasp on their winter tempo. Even so, there was an almost heroic patience about them. Winter, to the early settler, was both adversary and roommate. They learned to endure it not with joy, but with the kind of gentle stubbornness found in oxen, grandmothers, and well-trained mules. And so they sat, and knitted, and ladled stew, and gazed out frosted windows into a world temporarily replaced by powdered silence. Every creak of the house was a reminder they'd weathered another day. Every dawn offered one snowflake closer to thaw. But while the snow muffled the land and the world slowed to a whisper, something else stirred with every shivering settler. The first hints of change, the smallest signs of movement. Not just the shift of seasons, but of people ready to press forward, even if it meant having to dig themselves out first. And with that gentle thought, let us nudge open the creaky cabin door and peek beyond the piled drifts, where the settlers' frozen patience would soon meet the first promises of thaw. There is something oddly romanticized about the image of early settlers braving the winter winds with courage in their eyes and icicles in their beards. But one imagines that, deep down, most of them would have traded all that poetic frostbite for a dry stocking and a hot bowl of stew, preferably served indoors and without the company of rats. As December shadows fell thicker with every rotation of the moon, the practical challenges of cold weather survival took precedence over bold New World ambitions. Nowhere was this more evident than in the humble and often haphazardly built early colonial homes. These were not winter palaces. No, the average settler cabin offered about as much protection from the elements as a modern garden shed dipped in wishful thinking. A single-room structure, sometimes with gaps so wide between the timber logs you could wave at the neighbor's goat right through the wall. Chinking, the process of stuffing moss, clay, and other forest fluff into gaps to keep the breeze out, was an art form born of desperation. Families would crouch by their hearths as wind hissed through the chinks like 1,000 gossipy ghosts, chilling one's bones and whispering all the juicy details about Mr. Whittaker's suspiciously well-fed hog. And then there was the chimney. Or, for some unlucky settlers, the suspiciously smoky absence of one. Early fireplaces were testaments to fiery optimism. Chimneys were often short, narrow, and partially responsible for why many winter garments permanently smelled like smoked squirrel. But even with a properly huffing hearth, keeping the entire cabin warm was a dream best filed away alongside notions of proper sleep and unalienable rights to heated floorboards. For most, the fire blazed only in one corner, while the other half of the room resembled the back end of a sleet storm. One end of your face might feel like toast, the other like a snowshoe. Layering was key. Early settlers pioneered the concept of wearing all of one's clothes at once, a style decision partly out of necessity, and partly because the thought of putting on icy trousers in the morning was an affront to the human spirit. Blankets, if you were lucky to have them, were made of wool with the texture of barbed wire. They itched, but warmly. If you lacked blankets, you layered animal pelts, sometimes with the animal still attached and occasionally annoyed by the indignity. Family members slept together in clumps, not for sentimentality, but for heat conservation. Little Eliza squished next to Grandpa William, who snored like a bear, and young Thomas rolled tightly between his parents like a sausage in the world's least luxurious roll-up. Nighttime trips to the facilities, by which we mean the icy depths of an outhouse, if one existed, or a strategically placed chamber pot, became high-stakes adventures. The chamber pot was a portal to warmth minimally disrupted, while the outhouse was the Arctic frontier. It is said that some colonists trained themselves not to drink much after sundown, purely to avoid answering nature's call in the small hours. Whether out of discipline or bladder-based defeat, the practice created some of the most quietly determined figures in early modern history. Then there was the matter of waking up, rising from frozen bedding while your breath hung in the air like miniature ghosts. That deserved a congressional medal. One needed to leap from bed and hurtle toward the fire before one's extremities staged a formal rebellion. At the heart of these winters was not just survival, but the gentle rhythm of persistence. Cracking wood, wind-racked trees, one's daily argument with frozen socks. It all became part of a life intently lived. The fire was stoked, the stew stirred, and despite everything, stories were still told in the evenings. Tales of old lands, of sea voyages and distant relatives, of foxes smarter than their trappers and neighbours whose eyebrows had frozen into expressions of eternal surprise. Around the hearth, history was not written, but whispered, in the smoky warmth of family breath and flickering flame. And just as winter pressed thick against the crooked window panes, life inside pressed back, quietly, resolutely, hackle-raised chickens and all. In the deep-breath silence of those snow-wrapped nights, people found resilience, laced it with humour, and wrapped it in another itchy blanket. And soon, as the firelight dipped and logs cracked like distant musket fire, another day of winter would come to an end, only to begin again the moment someone had to get up for more firewood, but more on firewood, and the timeless grumbling that came with gathering it just ahead. While the wind howled like a homesick poet outside their wooden cabins, early settlers discovered a curious truth about winter. It was less about surviving snowdrifts and more about surviving each other. Cabins, of course, were cozy in the same way a pickle jar is cozy, for the pickle. Not so much for 6 people, several wet dogs, and a goat named Mildred, who never quite learned she was not one of the children. These cramped quarters were the Western Hemisphere's least glamorous reality television show, Colonial Cabin Mates. Except nobody got voted off, and the only challenge was to not lose your mind by February. The hearth was the breathing heart of the home, transforming tiny rooms into sweaty saunas on one side and icy polar outposts on the other. You could roast a turkey with your left cheek and get frostbite on your right. Children played games that required minimal movement, because moving meant relinquishing your spot near the fire. Oh yes, fireplace real estate was hot property, quite literally. Family arguments were often fought and resolved based on who was willing to go fetch more firewood. Speaking of firewood, it was, in colonial times, an altar upon which hopes and lower back muscles were sacrificed daily. One could measure a family's status not in gold or land, but by the neatness of their wood pile. A perfectly stacked cord was a quaint sign of competence, while a haphazard heap suggested imminent frostbite and possibly marital discord. In the deep tedium of long nights, when the only thing longer than darkness was Uncle Thomas's stories about walking uphill both ways, people turned to diversions. Knitting became less a hobby and more a national security measure. Stockings, scarves, and mittens emerged with such frequency that one wonders how there aren't enormous mounds of colonial woolwear buried in attics to this day. If archaeologists ever find a trove of 18th century mittens, it will be from this very winter madness. Board games were few, but storytelling was abundant. Tales could be spooky or silly, often passed down, altered, embroidered, and distractedly invented on the spot when no one could quite remember the ending. Imagine a version of Jack and the Beanstalk where Jack slips on the beans and decides to take up fishing instead. This was the quality of post-dinner entertainment. It might not win awards, but it did tie the brain together just tightly enough to keep cabin fever from becoming an actual fever. Meals were predictable. Mush, pudding, stew, repeat. Winter cuisine was not about variety, but about triumph. If it wasn't moldy and you didn't choke, you called it dinner. Root vegetables featured heavily because they had the charming habit of not dying. Carrots and turnips became culinary celebrities, leading roles in 1,000 indistinguishable stews. And while spices were rare, salt was a precious gem that could transform despairing boiled cabbage into slightly saltier despair. Outside, livestock fared no better than their masters. Chickens huddled like gossiping dowagers. Pigs gave the stink eye to swirling snow, and cows produced milk with a distinctly judgmental flavour. Only geese seemed unfazed, striding through snowdrifts like feathered philosophers on their morning promenade. Inside, meanwhile, new hobbies emerged. Quilting bees buzzed not for fashion but for warmth, and diary keeping reached peak sarcasm. Journals from the time read like sitcom scripts gone moody. Today I watched snowfall for 4 consecutive hours. The goats sneezed again. Papa says it's just hay fever. I suspect it's scurvy disguised in rebellion. The psychological toll of winter was rarely discussed out loud, mostly because doing so would require developing a vocabulary that went beyond cold, and so cold my teeth hurt. But one could see it in the 1,000-yard stare of Pa as he split his 400th log, or the way Ma buttered bread with shaking hands and whispered nothings to the dough. It is a historic truth that the early American character was forged in fire. Firewood, that is, and splinters. Still, perseverance was its own peculiar treasure. For every day winter dragged its frostbitten heels, settlers responded with stubbornness. And by the time late February arrived, along with the first suspicious puddle that hinted at melting, they would allow themselves to hope just a little. Perhaps tomorrow they wouldn't have to wear every article of clothing at once. As the snow creaked beneath the weight of its own tyranny, and the days inched longer by mere moments, something old and silent stirred in the frost-covered fields outside. Not quite spring, not quite thaw, but something. And in the half-melted ruts near the woodpile, fresh footprints would soon mark the next frontier in their winter tale. As the wind curved low over the hillocks and evergreen clusters, early settlers found themselves entrenched in a peculiar seasonal ritual, the winter shoelace dilemma. You see, in a world where buttons were worth their weight in convenience and Velcro had yet to burst gloriously onto the scene, shoelaces were serious business. And in winter, they froze. Not metaphorically, literally. A good pair of leather boots laced tightly was the only thing between your toes and frostbite's frosty handshake. But each morning, many a settler would descend from their straw-stuffed mattress, colder than a debtor's pocket, and discover that their shoelaces had turned to frozen sticks overnight. You could, if you fancied a round of laughter at your own expense, thwack them against the door frame like old carrots. Life was made of such minor injustices. Firewood that refused to ignite out of sheer spite. Jerky that could break a molar. Candles that gave up mid-paragraph. And yet, winter was also a time for storytelling. Not the kind spun with glittering dragons and gallant quests, though the occasional ghost yarn did make an appearance after the third mug of cider. No, these tales were practical. Recountings of the great blizzards, the time the roof collapsed under snow, or the year the squirrel got into the salt pork and stayed. You'd imagine the company was dreary, but you'd be mistaken. Laughter was often louder than the wind outside, a kind of kooky, claustrophobic glee built up inside cramped cabins. Something about being stuck indoors with the same 5 people for 6 weeks brought out the best and weirdest in folks. Old Aunt Prudence, who hadn't cracked a joke since the Continental Congress, might suddenly invent a shadow puppet theatre using mittens and a fork. And then, of course, there was the soup. Winter soup wasn't just sustenance. It was survival, morale, and minor witchcraft, all stewed in one iron pot. Ingredients were frequently interpretive. A watery blend of root vegetables, a sliver of last month's salted pork, and, if luck was smiling, a lonely turnip. Mystery stew became a favourite among households, not because it was particularly tasty, but because everyone got to guess what the mystery was, usually ending in giggles and exaggerated stomach clutches. Still, the lean diet and long nights wore on the mind. Cabin fever was less a diagnosis and more a guaranteed rite of passage. Settlers coped by indulging in various quaint, questionably effective pastimes. Knitting went from hobby to obsession. Homemade board games scrawled in charcoal. Even the deeply competitive art of not blinking while looking out the window gained popularity. Edward from next door held the record, 4.5 minutes, though everyone knew he cheated during snowfall. Paper was too precious for journaling, so settlers often whispered their thoughts to cracks in the wall beams, as though passing on secrets to the trees. Whether this was catharsis or madness depended on the listener's own cabin temperament. But as one homespun proverb went, better to talk to the log than to punch thy cousin. It was also during these long winters that superstitions flourished. If your candle sputtered while reading, you were due for a visitor. If your bread failed to rise, someone in your vicinity had surely told a lie. And if the cat refused to come in on the third knock, well, lock the door and don't ask questions. The quiet toll winter took on marriages, friendships, and whether or not Timothy was just sharpening the axe or looking at me funny again can't be overstated. But perhaps it was this very test of patience and temperament that made the thaw so beloved. When the first drip of meltwater was heard sliding off the eaves, hope clothed itself in wool socks and creaked down the stairs. But for now, winter still had its thumb pressed down gently on every chimney smoke curl and roof beam creak. Outside, wind sculpted the snowdrifts into strange waves that reminded some of the ocean. Distant, wild, and obscenely warm by comparison. And inside, soup simmered, jokes flew, socks steamed by the hearth. And out of a spirit somehow equal parts stubborn and gentle, the settlers endured. Let us now reach the candle closer, pull the shawl a little tighter, and meander further, for there's another curious matter waiting in the next snow-blanketed step, by the time February tiptoed in, on frostbitten toes naturally. Our early settlers were beginning to deeply question their life choices, along with the structural integrity of their chimney caps. You see, while we modern folk trudge through the shortest month of the year mumbling about Valentine's Day and getting stuck in snowdrifts behind Subarus, the colonial folk were experiencing a different kind of February. The month where cabin fever reached its full, poorly ventilated crescendo. That age-old malady, cabin fever, was not just poetic back then. It was surprisingly literal. Take one room, add smoke from a damp fire, an entire family attempting to churn butter in the corner, someone doubtfully attempting music on a fiddle with 2 strings, and at least 6 pickled beets staring at you from the pantry shelf. Stir in 6 weeks of cloud-covered skies and subtract any hope of fresh fruit, and voila, you've got yourself the perfect colonial midwinter malaise. Now, during this time, settlers filled their long, torporous evenings with storytelling. Not thrilling tales of dragons or daring sea escapades. No. Those were considered far too exciting. Instead, they whispered the real blockbusters of the day, like the time the roof leaked for 12 hours, or how Abigail traded a button for 3 turnips. They were humble tales, grounded, often literally, since most of them were told sitting directly on dirt floors. But within these tales was a kind of quiet magic. Storytime wasn't just about passing time. It was one of the few ways people could maintain their connection to who they were before winter turned everyone into a slow-moving wool burrito. Grandparents passed down family legends. Mothers recited poetry by candlelight, albeit poorly remembered poetry. And children created fictional worlds where cloaks were warm and squirrels didn't chew through grain sacks. Amid it all, the hearth fire was the stage, the warmth, and sometimes the villain. Fires, while vital in these compact dwellings, had a tendency to act out. If a chimney became clogged with soot and nesting ambitions of confused poultry, smoke would spill indoors like a fog machine at a very poorly organized medieval prom. Often, families would simply open the door to let the smoke out, inviting in both fresh air and 8 degrees of Celsius regret. Still, they persisted, squinting through the haze, sipping lukewarm chicory root coffee, and waiting for the icicles on the ceiling beams to decide whether they were going to fall or become permanent sculptures. And then there were the ingenious ways they beat the cold, none of which are OSHA approved. Bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals, were tucked between sheets, transforming wooden bed frames into slightly hazardous saunas. Homespun foot warmers, often no more than heated bricks wrapped in rags, were tucked into boots or hidden under skirts with the quiet desperation of a person who simply could not endure another cold surprise to the ankle bone. Clothing, too, transformed from something vaguely fashionable into something that could feasibly be constructed from 3 quilts and a string. Entire outfits were worn to bed, and then the next day, and then questionably for several days after that. Changing clothes during winter was treated like an act of bold defiance, like running into battle, but with slightly more perceptible body odor. To pass the time and distract themselves from the icy draught sneaking down the back of their necks, settlers turned to crafts. Men whittled, women spun wool, children carved puzzles or baked apples over the coals. Every member of the household found some rhythm in the monotony, some purposeful gesture in the stillness. It was a season where motion slowed until kindness itself became a kind of lifeline. A warm glance, a shared mitten, a story retold exactly how it was last night, because routine, it turns out, is incredibly cozy. And as the nights inched toward March, the monotony of midwinter turned into something else, a quiet resolve. Each dripping icicle, each tiny widening crack in the snow crust outside felt like a gentle promise. The world would not stay frozen forever. The fire would burn just a bit brighter tomorrow. And the first green shoot, though still weeks away, was imagined nightly by dreamers who knew winter could test them, but never truly claimed their hope. There was a distinct art to enduring winter in those days, one built on slow patience and woolen stubbornness. And as the snow hung on in clumps like forgetful guests refusing to leave, settlers began that subtle, delightful shift from enduring winter to quietly preparing for spring, which, as we'll soon see, brings its own peculiar triumphs and trials. As dusk curled itself over the snow-blanketed fields like a sleepy cat, the early American settlers tucked themselves into their brittle wooden homes, not because they had finished their chores, but because the cold outside was auditioning for a role as the villain in a bad opera. Winter had a particular flair for melodrama in those days, arriving not as a gentle whisper of frost, but more like a cranky guest barging in mid-November and refusing to leave until April. Or May, if it was feeling especially petty. Ah, the joys of 18th century insulation. Picture this: thin wood planks, an honest attempt at chinking made with mud or moss, and a fireplace that warmed precisely 3 feet in front of it, while the rest of the house resembled the inside of an icebox with a fireplace aesthetic. Every night was a team-building exercise in how to huddle efficiently. Family members, pets, and occasionally livestock if things were truly desperate. And food. Let's speak quietly about food. Winter meals during colonial times were less about recipes and more about creative interpretations of what hadn't spoiled yet. A classic dinner might include dry salt pork, potatoes that wished they hadn't been unearthed, and stale bread softened politely with water, or, on festive occasions, cider. If you were very lucky, there might be a preserved apple in the root cellar that hadn't grown a respectable beard of fuzz. Preservation was a full-time job even before the frost hit. Smoking, drying, salting. Techniques honed through generations who, frankly, had run out of other options. And the concept of fresh vegetables was politely excused from the winter table entirely. Frozen kale had yet to trend on Pinterest, and canning jars wouldn't be widely available until the 19th century. So yes, folks gathered around a pot of turnip soup and considered it a triumph of human ingenuity. Entertainment, meanwhile, leaned on being resourceful, to put it kindly. With night falling around 4 p.m, families gathered near the hearth because, frankly, anywhere else might result in frostbite, and told stories, sang songs, or played word games that sound suspiciously like what people now do at artisanal board game cafes. A spirited round of I Spy could last a while when the only visible things were smoke, shadow, or mother's woolen sock. Letters written during these depths of winter can still be read in archives, and they are delicious in their restrained despair. One Massachusetts farmer noted in January of 1772 that he could not locate his axe, and yet was told the woodpile must persist in diminishing. That same gentleman, undoubtedly a master of understatement, concluded his entry by stating, "Morale is fair, but trending toward brittle." By February, most households had settled into a kind of sleepwalking rhythm. Days were marked by repetitive chores, collecting firewood, milking frozen stubborn cows, and reassuring the hens that the sun hadn't been kidnapped. Nights, however, took on that dreamy quality we might now associate with camping trips. Romantic in theory, but deeply reliant on whether the roof leaked or the draft snuck in like a mischievous ghost. Outside, the landscape sat quiet and vast beneath a blanket of unrelenting white, broken only by wolf tracks and the occasional adventurous squirrel regretting all its life choices. The silence was profound, a quiet so deep that the snapping of a twig could sound like a cannon, and the jangling of a sleigh harness a symphony. There was something humbling, though, even noble, about these long winters. They forced a realignment of priorities: warmth, survival, togetherness. The fast pace of spring and summer gave way to a slower, more deliberate way of life. People spoke in softer tones, moved with caution, and found amusement in the smallest of familial graces. A baby's hiccup, the slow melt of an icicle, or the way smoke curled into the night sky like a message to no one in particular. And through it all, the settlers endured. Not always gracefully, mind you. The number of cabin squabbles likely outpaced the number of successful sled rides, but with a quiet tenacity that knitted them into the fabric of the land itself. Now, as one last ember flickers in the hearth, and the wind presses its palm against the windows, we leave our weary settlers bundled beneath quilts stitched from memory and necessity. Outside, snow continues to fall in flakes wide as feathers, shushing the world into stillness. Soon, the sun will stir again in the sky, and spring will tiptoe over the horizon. But tonight, winter still reigns, and before the thaw, there is one last story waiting to be told under the weight of silence and wool. As the final wisps of winter clung to the branches and the faintest promise of thaw drifted through the air, the early settlers, grizzled, hollow-eyed and smelling faintly of smoked turnip, knew they had almost made it. Almost. You see, for all their grit and prayer, early spring was often the cruelest joke of all. By late March, the snow was no longer a majestic white quilt. It was a slushy, boot-eating soup. Roads became rebellious streams of mud determined to claim one's shoes and dignity in equal measure. Wagons sank, cows sulked, and anyone tall enough to think about California began seriously entertaining that idea. The planting season arrived not with a grand celebration, but with skeptical squints at the sky, mutterings about last year's frost, and one very cautious toe poking the garden soil. Seeds, which had been guarded like treasure through the long winter, were handled with reverence, each one a gamble against the lingering chill and cheeky robins with no sense of property laws. Contrary to our modern dreams of pastoral serenity, early settlers were not skipping through tulip fields. Gardening meant wrestling with matted roots, rocks, and possibly a buried raccoon the dog helped inter last fall. And yet, it was all done with a dogged hope, the sort only winter survivors possesses, the kind forged in the iron furnace of January's frostbitten mornings and February's suspicious stews of unknown meat. But even as the earth softened and life stirred, quite literally, thanks to spring's sudden enthusiasm for breeding season, the memory of winter never quite eased from their bones. They'd count their potatoes nervously, recheck their salt stockpile, and steal one last glance at the woodshed to see if old Thomas had maybe, not promising anything, seen a bear in there last fall and forgot to mention it. And of course, there were the ailments that arrived just as one uncurled from a season spent hunched near a fire. Spring fever was a real diagnosis back then, though it bore little resemblance to our modern Instagrammed variety. Imagine staggering into the sunlight after months indoors, skin paler than flour and joints creaking like unoiled barn hinges. You weren't frolicking, you were upright, which was achievement enough. They rubbed ointments on their cracked hands, bit through lingering colds with root teas and wild hope, and waited for green things to grow like the earth was personally forgiven. And when the first leaves pushed through the frost-nipped soil, they didn't just think of soup, they thought of survival. Carrots as a balm for the soul, peas as a peace treaty between man and Mother Nature. Yes, spring rewarded. The days grew longer, lighter, kinder, but settlers were seldom fooled. Winter wasn't gone. He was just folding his cloak, making a show of his retreat. They'd known him too well, blustering into their lives with snow and silence, and leaving behind stables that had to be cleaned and wood piles that needed replacing. Still, there was beauty in it, the way hardship hitched people together, the way a neighbour's meagre cabbage became a shared miracle, the way song returned to quiet forests, and smoke from the chimney switched from desperate survival to the gentle hum of bread baking and hopes rising. Among all the painful, frostbitten, tooth-rattling truths, perhaps the most precious became clear in winter's long farewell, that even the harshest seasons had an end, that no matter how many boots froze or roofs leaked or mittens were devoured by the stove, light would return, and with it a gentler pace, a candle flickering on a newly dusted windowsill, a child daring to take off their scarf indoors, a settler leaning back in a handmade chair, staring at the soft blue dusk, and not feeling afraid of what came next. So as we close our eyes beside these echoing fires and softened fields, let us drift gently with the weary, warmed souls of those long ago winters. Let our thoughts quiet like settling snow. Let our minds pause where the cold once lived, and where, slowly, sweetly, the spring stirred. And there, let us sleep.